Most chess amateurs look at a chessboard and are, for the most part, seen a blank. Depending on their experience and knowledge, they might notice a tactic here or there, but in general, they're completely unable to ask the following question. What's happening in this position and what should both sides be doing? You would think that everyone would have an answer. But when looking at a position, the majority of players choose to calculate by internally saying, I go there, he goes there, I go there, etc. They don't know what they're trying to find, but they hope that something will occur to them. A brilliant move will appear and victory will follow. In many ways, this reminds me of someone getting into his car and driving aimlessly. His wife might call him on his cell phone and ask, where are you going? But he has no idea, so he keeps driving, turning here and there, and sometimes that bears fruit. He might pass by a bowling alley a mile or two away from his house and think, I didn't know that was there. I love bowling. And so we get a happy ending. Chess players are pretty much doing the same thing, hoping to find that unknown move that will make everything okay. So their thoughts are a move by move and threat by threat, and I go there and he goes there affair. You might strike oil from time to time, but you don't really know why. Sadly, most chess players are unaware that the chessboard is actually speaking to them. The board itself is telling them what to do. I call this the body language of the board. In this lecture, we're going to learn to read that body language by making use of a concept I created 30 years ago called imbalances. And though quite a few of you might be rolling your eyes at the thought of having to learn some complex chess unified field theory, I'm going to give you some very good news. You already know the imbalances. That's right. In sneaky fashion, I've been feeding you one component of the imbalances after another. And now you're familiar with all the separate parts. What we're going to do here is teach you to notice them and then come up with a plan, or at least a move that caters to the board's needs. So, what is an imbalance? It's something that can change the status quo, something you have that your opponent doesn't. Here's a list. The battle between the bishop and knight, where both players try to make their minor piece superior to the other. Pawn structure, the board's skeleton, which speaks more loudly than any other imbalance. An advantage in space, which leaves the enemy's pieces gasping for breath. A material advantage, being one pawn up is often enough to make world champions fall to their knees. Creating and or using an open file so your rooks can show their muscles. Pawn weaknesses, like doubled pawns, weak squares, isolated pawns. Whole strategies are based on this. Lead in development, a dynamic advantage which calls for quick action before the undeveloped side has a chance to get his pieces into play. King safety, a vulnerable enemy king offers the attacker a real chance to end the game quickly and elegantly. Statics versus dynamics, knowing when to build in a safe manner and when to take off your tie and leap into battle. We've discovered these things, and all of them can win games by themselves. But you can't make use of them if you don't notice or create them. Let's start with a very imbalanced position. If you're motivated to do so, please take notes, writing down the pluses and minuses for both sides, and who you think is better and why. List all of these things, then compare them with my comments. Keep in mind that you'll probably find your notes are quite different than mine. That's to be expected. But the more you practice looking for all the imbalances, the faster your imbalance comprehension will be. The first thing everyone notices is Black's insanely bad pawn structure. He not only has tripled E pawns, but he also has doubled A pawns. These pawns can be attacked by Rook E1 or Rook A1. We'll give round one to White, who has a clear static advantage. Black's a pawn up. It's not much of a pawn, but it never hurts to be material ahead. The second round goes to Black and his extra pawn, a static plus. Black's king can come into the action by King F7, defending E6 and E7. Well, white's king is stuck far, far away on h1. In some lines, the poor placement of white's king can lead to a back-rank mate. Thus, round 3 is black's and his superior dynamic king. Black's rook is eyeing the c2 pawn. Since white's knight is blocking black's rook, black will need to get rid of it in any way possible. On the other hand, white's rook can go after the e4 pawn by rook e1 or the weak a pawns by rook a1. The fourth round can be considered a tie since both sides' rooks are dynamic and they have plenty of room to roam about in and plentiful targets to attack. The rooks would be of equal value except black's king can't be threatened by white's rook, while black's rook can threaten back-rank mate to white's king. Thus, black's dynamic rook has a harder punch than white's. White's bishop is staring down a fairly useless h2 to b8 diagonal, while black's bishop is x-raying right through to b2. You compare that to white's hitting air. Also, once the f6 knight moves, it will help open up that a1 to h8 diagonal for black's bishop, which will then threaten to capture the c3 knight. Black's dynamic bishop rules since his is aimed at the b2 pawn while white's isn't aiming at anything. So, round 5, clearly black. White's knight is stuck on c3 since it doesn't want to let the black rook chop on c2, where it will own the c-file and also find itself happily living on the 7th rank. Black's knight is far more dynamic and will move to d5 right here, challenging the enemy knight while also freeing up his bishop. The 6th round also goes to black, whose knight is dynamic and superior, while white's is defensive and trying to stop the enemy hordes from penetrating the c-file. Overall, white has a far better pawn structure, but black's pieces are much more dynamic. Thus, we have a classic statics versus dynamics battle. In this case, the dynamics will dominate the statics. It doesn't matter which side you are on in this game. White has to try to make his structure boss while turning black's structure into edible bits, while black has to try and make his dynamics take over the board. Let's see how all that intellectual deconstruction translates to real board action. Rook a1, getting ready to eat those pawns. Instead of, groveling and guarding the pawn, black immediately plays actively. Knight to d5. Black statically worse, so the board is screaming at black to make use of his dynamics. If you don't notice your dynamics, and if you don't use them, then white's far superior structure will win the day. So black leaps into battle and obeys the board. White immediately gobbles one of the pawns. Notice that if white took the knight, he would fix black's pawns, and suddenly they'd be healthy again. So he didn't want to do that. So he took the pawn. Now he threatens this e6 pawn. And so even though he also threatens the other a7 pawn, black takes a moment out to guard that e6 pawn. King f7. And white has another meal. Black's a pawns have been devoured, they're just a memory. But now it's black's turn. So, in this situation, black decides, I'm going to take on c3, but with which one? It turns out in this case that the knight is actually more important here than the bishop. And so, black chops off with his bishop. Of course, you have to take back. And he takes with the rook. Of course, now material is even, but c2 is dying, and he needs to do something about that. And in this position, white makes a mistake. He really needs to play passively and just retreat back and grovel. Not good, but it's all he had. Instead, he decided, well, I don't like this back rank thing, and he pushed his pawn so that his king won't be in danger, even though it's still out of play. He takes it, the pawns are traded, and then the king makes a move. I don't really understand where it's going. I guess he's hoping to somehow head towards the middle of the board, but that'll never happen. Black pushes the front tripled pawn. He has to take it, and after knight takes, Suddenly, G2 is under attack. There's a problem here, because if he tries to defend with something like bishop f2, then knight g4 hits this and also threatens a back rank mate again. So things are going from bad to worse for poor white, and he plays bishop to d6. Rook takes g2 check, king h1, the rook gets away. White is still trying to take stuff. He takes the bishop, and black guards his pawn. And now the mix, after we trade this, of 2 pawns versus 1 is totally against white. This is a theoretical win for black, and black had no problem winning for 2 reasons. 1, he's a pawn ahead. 2 is that he has 2 connected pass pawns versus 1. And 3, white's king is passive and even in danger in some lines, and all those things conspire to lead to a hopeless position. Our next example of imbalance hunting is very different than the previous one. It's black's move. As before, take out your notebook, write down the imbalances for both sides, and then write down the move you feel is black's most logical course due to those imbalances. The breakdown is clear. The pawn skeleton says it all. White's pawns are healthy, while black's pawns on a5 and especially c5 are extremely vulnerable. And of course, we also have doubled isolated pawns, which we know aren't particularly good. White's bishop is already taking aim at the target on c5, and at any moment, white's knight will join in by leaping to a4, doubling on this thing. So c5 is going to be dragged down because the queen can also add its punch by queen f2, joining with the bishop. Round 1 goes to white, who has an overwhelming static advantage. The d file is open, but both sides have a rook on it, so it doesn't really matter. Round 2, equal. Black has 2 bishops. White has a bishop and knight. 2 bishops are strong in an open position, but the position is blocked by pawns, and both black bishops aren't particularly alive. On the other hand, white's bishop is aiming at c5, and the knight can join it with knight a4 hitting c5. Round 3 is white's because his 2 minor pieces can attack the target on c5. Effective dynamics versus a static weakness, while black's bishops aren't doing much of anything. Overall, black is strategically lost, since every imbalance is either equal, mutual control of the d file, or heavily in white's favor due to the pawn structure. And here we come to a state of mind. Pure defense isn't going to hold up, and if you're black, you need to be honest with yourself. But what can you do? Your minor pieces are worse than white's, and your pawn structure is manifestly inferior. Many players with the black pieces would trade rooks on the d file, lose that c5 pawn, and fall on their face in total defeat, like a cow going to the slaughterhouse. Depressing, isn't it? But there's another, albeit scary, path to take. Since your pawn structure is so bad, and since that same pawn structure is blocking your own bishops, and since normal moves are going to lose, you have to look outside that normal move box and find a way to change the pawn skeleton. After all, your skeleton is fatally crippled, and you have to find a way to mend it or die. And this is one of those main differences between very strong players and inexperienced ones. Inexperienced players usually don't label the imbalances, and even if they do, the realities of what they discovered is overwhelming and they won't put up any resistance. But the really good player will ponder all this information, realize that it's a fix the structure or die situation, and come up with rook to d4. This is a very advanced move, but it's his only hope. Black is giving up his rook for a white minor piece. That's a 2-point loss. How can this be good? I'll explain after the rook is captured. He could take with the bishop, but he decided to take with the knight instead. He knew the rook wasn't going to move away. Bishop c8, getting that bishop back into play. Knight takes d4, gobbling the gift. C takes d4, bishop to f2, c5. So here we stand. What has black gained by giving up a rook for a minor piece? Well, the pawn structure is now completely different. In our original position, the one labeled then, black has no dynamic possibilities and suffered from a catastrophically bad pawn structure. White would easily pick off the c5 pawn by knight a4 and queen f2. White would have won a pawn and would still have retained a complete grip on the position. In our present position, labeled now, for the price of just one tiny point, since a rook is worth 5 and the knight is worth 3, black sacrificed 2 points but would have lost one if he didn't. Thus, the true loss is just 1 point. Black's pawns are no longer vulnerable. White's pieces are no longer active, and black is enjoying an obvious space advantage in the center. The lesson to be learned here is always make sure you have something to play for, some advantages to make use of, and if you have to sacrifice a bit of material to accomplish that, so be it. In a way, it's a new game. Black wants to increase his space on the king side by f7 to f5, and he wants to increase the activity of his bishops. White, on the other hand, needs to get his rooks into play since the extra rook is the only advantage his position has. As you can see, right now both rooks are dead in the water. Before we go over the rest of the game, allow me to pose a puzzle. If you were white here, what would you do, and why would you do it? Remember, the answer needs to be based on the position's imbalances. As you know, rooks belong on open files, and at the moment, they don't have any. With this in mind, White's only course of action is to play for a b4 advance, opening up the queen side and giving the rooks the roads they so desperately need. Remember, you have a rook versus a minor piece. Your rooks are useless without open files. So if you want to make use of them, you need to open files. That should be the only thing you worry about here. And so play might go, and this necessarily isn't best play for black, a3, f5, rook to eb1, f4, gaining lots of space, bishop e1. Notice he's putting everything he has on the b4 square so he can advance that pawn. Black is trying to get something going on the king side, and he smashes open the queen side. Things are opened up. You push the passed pawn forward. You're going to win this b pawn because you have all these pieces on it, and your rooks are suddenly going to have tons of files, and you're going to be doing very well. That's great, but it didn't happen in the game. Of course, black could have defended better here, but the simple fact is, if you create a plan that caters to the positive imbalance in your position, good things are going to happen. In the actual game, white never got his rooks into play, and so black's pluses took over the game. Let's return to the actual game. White played rook f1, a terrible move. It doesn't do anything to activate the rooks. Black keeps trying to make new gains. He pushes the f-pawn. Bishop g3, bishop to d7. And now white realizes that he does not want to take this because then black would have these incredibly powerful passed pawns. So he avoids that, and instead he just sticks his other rook in the middle. I don't know what this does. f4, gaining more space. Bishop f2, g5. And we'll end it here with the following comment. In general, you needed to work with the rooks if you're white. He'd failed to do that. Now black is going to start pushing all his pawns on the king side and get a king side attack. In the meantime, white is doing nothing. He's just sitting there, his rooks are dead, and he's just going to wait to die. White is doomed here. His king is under siege, his bishop is dead, his rooks are dead, and in the end, he went on to lose. How did this happen? Black, who had an inferior position, sacrificed material to give himself some positive pluses to make use of. In the rest of the game, black continued to make use of these positive imbalances, while white, who needed to get his rooks into the game, failed to do so, and as a result, ended up in this miserable position and lost. The moral of the story? If you don't listen to the board and make use of what's available to you, you shouldn't be surprised when your position rolls over and dies. Quite often, the imbalanced battlegrounds are created right in the opening. And if you don't notice what your opponent is doing or what your opponent is all about, you'll find that you missed the boat and your opponent is all over you. E4, knight f6. This is Alakines Defense, named after the fourth world champion, Alexander Alakine. The idea is to provoke White's center pawns forward and then put pressure on them with his pieces and pawns. And sure enough, this is what happens. White has the center, Black chips away at the center. White gains more of the center, and White gains even more of the center. Both sides need to know their role in this position. If Black doesn't attack White's pawn center, he will find that his opponent has a huge space advantage that is seriously restricting his pieces. If White doesn't protect his center pawns, he might well find that his mighty center is crumbling around him. Black took, and then Black brings his knight out, attacking this pawn. White defends the pawn, and Black brings out another piece. White develops, because we have to get developed. E6, freeing the other piece now, the bishop. Knight f3, bishop to e7. And now we have a parting of the ways. White can play bonkers here and play d5, just going for it. And this leads to incredible complications. And so what we have instead of strategy is just pure tactics and manic threats happening every moment of the game. And usually in that type of thing, you need to be all booked up for theory. If you don't want to play like that, and that's an option for White, you would continue playing in a more level-headed manner and just simply develop your pieces. Both sides would castle. F6 would occur, hitting the pawn. He would take, and what happens is that Black has pressure on this pawn here with the knight, bishop, and queen, and White is defending it with his knight, bishop, and queen, and has a nice center. So both sides have their pluses. It's considered to be about equal with a very fine edge equality, both sides teetering on the edge, and anything can happen in the future of the game. White enjoys a small lead in development, though it's a temporary thing since Black will castle and catch up in another move or two. However, White can use that tiny window of time to improve his position in some manner, which takes us to the other imbalances. White has an isolated pawn right here, c3. This kind of pawn is often weak, and if Black was allowed to develop and place his rooks on the c-file, it might turn out to be a liability. But White actually views this pawn as a positive feature. Why? This takes us to the most important imbalance in the game. White has two bishops. Thus, we are facing a minor piece battle. Both sides have a light-squared bishop, though White's is on a longer diagonal. The big difference is White's dark-squared bishop, which Black can't match. Overall, since the main focus of the battle will be the minor piece clash, White wants to retain his dark-squared bishop at all costs while also using his c-pawn to kick the enemy knight off of d5. Remember that knights aren't very good if they don't have an advanced support point to live on. White's first order of business is to retain his bishop. Right now, Black's d5 knight is threatening to take it off, which will seek to lay claim to the dark squares along the a3 to f8 diagonal or the a1 to h8 diagonal. After that, White will use the c-pawn to kick the enemy knight off of d5 and gain important central and queenside space. All this might not sound very exciting, but it's all the board offers at the moment, so both sides are duty-bound to obey the board's dictates and make use of the factors I just mentioned. First on the agenda, he keeps his bishop and stops the knight from capturing it. Black castles. Then we kick the knight away. Black has to move his knight away, and he attacks the queen. We move our queen back. Black gains a little bit of space with his pawn. We move our bishop to c3, putting pressure on that pawn. The knight jumps in, defends the pawn, and kicks our queen again. And we move our queen to c5, offering a queen trade. Black doesn't want to do that because if he takes, the knight becomes very strong and hits the pawn and the bishop. So he avoids the trade with queen e6. Rook fd1, rook fd8. White plays h3. And you can see the problem with the knight if it doesn't have a support point. This can be chased away. And so it has to go backwards. Then white starts dominating the file. Rook to d6. After rook d6, the queen, of course, is attacked. It has to retreat. And after rook ad1, you can see that the doubled rooks, which are incredibly powerful on that d file, combined with the power of white's bishops, places black under severe pressure. Remember, an imbalance isn't necessarily advantageous. It's just something that you have and your opponent doesn't. It might be something wonderful. It might be something that you wish you didn't have, or it might be something you deem as unimportant. Whatever it might be, you need to be aware of the imbalances for both sides. And if you do have something unimportant your opponent doesn't have, stop thinking it's unimportant and try and turn it into a gift from the heavens. In other words, make it important. The moral of the story is that even those that live for attacking chess have to make use of the imbalances. First noticing them, often creating them, slowly building one's position by using them, acquiring new advantages along the way, until the attack is not only possible, but is a direct consequence of all that happened before it.